American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute series of distinguished lectures on the American Bicentennial. Some of the nation's leading scholars and educators have been invited by the AEI to discuss their views on the American Bicentennial as part of the Institute's continuing program for promoting public discussion on the major issues of our time. The AEI is a nonpartisan, nonprofit institution located in Washington, D.C. In this lecture, the AEI speaker will be Dr. Robert Nisbet, professor of history and sociology at the University of Arizona in Tucson. The site of tonight's lecture is Georgetown University, located in historic Georgetown section of Washington, D.C., close by the picturesque and polluted Potomac River. Georgetown dates back to the pre-revolutionary days, and its first permanent building, Old Stone House, was completed in 1765. It is preserved today as a National Historic Site. The Chesapeake and Ohio Canal was based on a design by George Washington and helped turn Georgetown into a prosperous port. Barges carried lumber and other goods for over 200 miles inland into Georgetown, and from here the goods were shipped to their final destinations. The pathways along the side of the canal were for the mules, which pulled the barges along their way. But with the coming of the railroads, the canal quickly became obsolete and Georgetown went into a decline. For almost a century, it was not much more than an aging slum area. In the years before World War II, Georgetown began to come back to life. Dunbarton Oaks, a stately mansion, became the home of the United Nations Charter, and Georgetown became a fashionable and expensive place to live. John F. Kennedy lived in this house when he was a United States Senator. Today, Georgetown is populated by several world-famous diplomats, statesmen, journalists, and political figures. Georgetown University, the site of tonight's lecture, traces its beginnings to the earliest development of the Georgetown district. The Most Reverend John Carroll, the first Catholic bishop in the United States, began collecting funds for the first building in 1787. The building was completed in 1791, and the first student was enrolled. One of the earliest buildings on the Georgetown campus is known as Old North. From the steps of this building, George Washington addressed the students of Georgetown on several occasions, and so did Lafayette, other presidents, and scores of dignitaries throughout American history. While Georgetown was begun as a Catholic university, today half of its faculty and a third of its students are of other faiths. Some 10,000 students at Georgetown are offered a full academic program ranging from law and medicine to one of the world's most advanced and sophisticated language and linguistic laboratories. Being located in the heart of the diplomatic community, it should be no surprise that Georgetown became the location for the first school of foreign service in the United States, and the largest such school in the world. And because of its association with the diplomatic community, the tradition started by George Washington still survives. The most distinguished men in their fields consider it an honor to address the students of Georgetown University. That tradition continues tonight with the lecture by Professor Robert Nisbet on the social impact of the American Revolution. Dr. Nisbet is introduced by the project director for the AEI Distinguished Lecture Series, Dr. Stephen Tonser, professor of history at the University of Michigan.
Our speaker this evening was one of those few men who 30 years ago was thinking hard about community and society. His book, The Quest for Community, is considered by many to be one of the major works in historical sociology to have been written in the past half-century. It clearly establishes his place in the great tradition in sociology which reaches from de Maistre through de Tocqueville, Durkheim, and Tyrannize, and it establishes him as a coeval theoretician. The great sociologists have also been great historians. Professor Nisbet is no exception, and I am tempted to describe him as an intellectual historian with sociological insight. His lecture this evening, The Social Impact of the Revolution, will demonstrate, I think, how gracefully and rewardingly these two disciplines can live together. Professor Nisbet.
I thank you, Professor Tonser, for an introduction both gracious and generous. Ladies and gentlemen, may I begin by indicating the high sense of privilege that I feel to be lecturing on any subject at this university and in this magnificent hall, and particularly on the subject of the American Revolution. I am grateful indeed to the American Enterprise Institute, first for the splendid idea of a series on the bicentennial, and second and far from least, they honor the privilege, the sheer pleasure of being among its lecturers. I'm going to begin with a question that to many in the audience may seem almost irrelevant or perhaps impertinent. And the question is simply this: was there in fact an American Revolution at the end of the 18th century? I mean a revolution, one involving sudden, decisive, and irreversible changes in social institutions, groups, and traditions, in addition to the War of Liberation from England that we are more likely to celebrate. I could not have guessed before the last year or two of unusually intensive reading on the subject of the American Revolution how much controversy that question generates at the present time among professional historians. There are scholars whose answer to the question is strongly negative, that it was not a revolution in the sense with which we are most familiar in that world. There are other scholars whose affirmative answer to the question is emphatic. And furthermore, we discover it's been this way for a long time. Ever since Edmund Burke, there have been observers to declare that revolution in any precise sense of the word did not take place in the colonies, that the essence of the matter was nothing more than one group of Englishmen fighting on distant shores for traditionally English political rights against a British government that sought to exploit and tyrannize. In other words, it was a war of restitution and liberation, but not a revolution. In outcome, one set of political governors replaced another. In J.L. Talman's words, the American Revolution was a purely political changeover. Fundamental institutions in society were not affected. But at opposite extreme is the view reaching from some of the founding fathers themselves down to some very able historians in our time. And this view, I think, is amply embodied in John Adams' statement in 1818 that not war, but revolution was the substance of what had happened. He wrote, "The revolution was in the minds and hearts of people, a change in their religious sentiments, of their duties and obligations. This radical change in the principles, opinions, sentiments, and affects of the people was the real American Revolution. Samuel Adams, ideologically somewhat to the left of John Adams a few years earlier, had written, "Was there ever a revolution brought about, especially so important a one as this, without great internal tumult and violent convulsions?" Now, I suggest that if there was a genuine revolution in America, we shall find it, however dimly by comparison with other revolutions in modern Western history, in the social sphere. The comparative study of revolution makes clear, I think, that the heart of each of the great modern revolutions is to be seen in the complex of authorities, functions, bonds, and allegiances, which we think of as social. More specifically, I refer to property, kinship, religion, and social class. Now, it's often said that the American colonies were lacking in feudalism. The statement is a fairly common one, I discover, in the literature, that America, quote, skipped the feudal stage, end quote. I cannot agree. The American colonies did indeed know feudalism. Now, when I refer to feudalism in the colonies, I certainly don't have anything in mind resembling the conceptual structure that Sir Henry Spelman gave this word when he coined it in the 17th century. Much less do I have in mind anything resembling the ideal type that was conceived by medieval crusaders for the kingdom of Jerusalem. Nor could we possibly pretend to find anything analogous in the colonies to the baronial class, the fiefdoms, and the systems of vassalage which flourished for several centuries in Western Europe. Actually, of course, there is a great deal of almost constant controversy among European medievalists as to which part of Europe did or did not have, quote, feudalism. And for a great many years, French historians have been extremely chary about allowing England the privilege, or the curse, as you will, of feudalism, simply on the ground that the celebrated oath of allegiance that William I exacted at Sarum from each freeman ruled out utterly, in the opinion of many French historians, constitutional historians, the possibility of those ascending intermediate ties that the French feel were crucial in feudalism. From the point of view of a sociologist or comparative historian, the essence of feudalism does not seem to me to lie in these more obvious structures, but rather in some of the following characteristics. First, an absence of centralization of political government. Second, a profusion of intermediate associations of all kinds. Also, a high degree of localism and regionalism. A clearly discernible stratification of rank and privilege. A distinct fusion of economic and political power, perhaps the crux of feudalism. An established church. Kinship united with landed property through provisions of primogeniture and entail. The real clue to feudalism, as Mark Bloch has stressed, lies foremost in the nature of what he called the ties of dependence. When these are deeply rooted in kinship and its surrogates, highly stratified, closely associated with the land and its tenure, with strong emphasis on continuity of title, local and center of legal gravity, a larger polity that is diffuse and decentralized, with the concept of a central government either dim or lacking altogether, we can properly refer in sufficient degree, I think, to the existence of a feudal society. Certainly, the American colonies met all of these criteria, even though no one would wish to declare feudalism in the colonies the equal in intensity of what was still existent at that time in Europe. Relationship to land counted a great deal in the colonies. What Sir Lewis Namur in his England in the Age of the American Revolution has written with England primarily in mind applies no less to the American colonies. Quote, "The relations of groups of men to plots of land or organized communities to units of territory form the basic content of political history. Social stratifications and convulsions, primarily arising from the relationship of men to land, make the greater, not always conscious, part of the domestic history of nations. And even under urban and industrial conditions, ownership of land counts for more than is usually supposed. End of quote. It counted for a great deal in the colonies. From Maine to Georgia, American life was rooted in the land. Never mind the fisheries and manufactures of New England. As Benjamin Franklin said some years after the Revolutionary War, these did not occupy more than 1/10 of the number of persons engaged in New England's less than benign setting in straight farming.
We are watching Dr. Robert Nisbet discussing the social impact of the American Revolution. Dr. Nisbet has pointed out that a form of feudalism existed in the colonies before the Revolution. In just a moment, he will continue his discussion of that social condition. In the 1970s, Georgetown is one of the most active and attractive sections of the nation's capital. Some residents, in fact, think it might be a little too active. Bustling M Street is Georgetown's main thoroughfare. While President Washington could ride his horse along what is now M Street in 5 or 6 minutes, today it takes the driver of a high-powered automobile as long as 30 minutes in the rush hour. Among Georgetown's main attractions are its lovely homes and surroundings. But as Dr. Nisbet is pointing out in his Georgetown lecture, the homes here today are no rival to some of the great estates found in pre-revolutionary America.
Now, from every known sociological point of view, it is entirely characteristic of human beings that they would approach the unknown with perspectives drawn from the known, that they would occupy the new world with ideas, customs, and techniques brought from the old. Hence, among other elements, the significant number of great estates, some of them vast by European standards, that we find in New York, in the Middle Atlantic area, and in the coastal South. And with these great estates, traditional ways of running them. I don't question the fact that the New World also brought new ideas and techniques, and some of these are assuredly to be seen in the colonies. Adaptations, however small, that bespeak the faculty of inventiveness in man. But these accepted, there is no gainsaying the number and size of estates in the colonies that could have excited the envy of even English proprietors. The manorial grants in New York embraced more than 2.5 million acres. We read that in 1769, some 5/6 of the people living in Westchester lived within the boundaries of great estates which were nothing if not feudal in the relationships which they created. The famous Van Rensselaer Manor up the Hudson measured some 24 by 28 miles, almost as large as Rhode Island. The Fairfax estate in Virginia had, at the height of its prosperity, 6 million acres. And the holdings of Lord Granville in North Carolina, as sumptuously furnished and tenanted as anything in England, were 1/3 of the entire colony. To be sure, there were small, independent farms in America, especially in New England and in the remoter areas of the South. But then so were there such holdings in England from the late Middle Ages on, and in France, too, before the Revolution in that country. The center of landed power lay, nevertheless, in England, in France, and also in the American colonies, with the great landowners, whether Dutch patroons up the Hudson or those in Virginia like the Fairfaxes, Washingtons, and so many others who were to take leading roles eventually in opposition to England. And from these large manorial estates sprang the class system that was a vivid feature of colonial America, clearly feudal in ultimate root and in essence. This system was surmounted by the large landowners. In wealth, power, culture, and breeding, this class was fit analog to the English aristocracy. There was little, if any, rhetoric about their equality with the rest of Americans. Admittedly, there was from early on a significant element of equalitarianism in New England. And this is the section we are most likely to have in mind when we speak of the non-feudal character of pre-revolutionary America. But in most of the rest of the American colonies, such equality was not often to be found. Below the great land-owning families, there were the tenant farmers. There were, of course, artisans, merchants, mechanics, laborers. There were indentured servants, and far from least in the colonies, the Negro slaves. Now let me refer briefly to one other aspect of American life that is certainly not without feudal connotation, the presence of established religions in several of the colonies. Apparently, in 9 of the 13 colonies, something in the way of established religion existed, though this assuredly could mean different things from one colony to another. Congregationalism reigned in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. In 6 other colonies, it was the Church of England. And in none of these, we find, was there a majority of the people that professed this established faith, even though they were obliged, under greater or less compulsion, to pay taxes toward the support of the established church of their colony. Finally, where feudalism is, there are always to be found primogeniture and entail. These quintessentially medieval customs, the first granting inheritance of land only to the oldest son, the second making alienation of property from the family difficult or impossible, were powerful in Europe, and it would have been, from a sociological point of view, extremely unlikely that Europeans would have come to this strange new land without these customs in mind. From the very beginning, primogeniture and entail took root, at least in a great many parts of the colonies. Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, New Jersey, Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia all knew primogeniture and entail in their laws. And at the outbreak of the Revolution, only Pennsylvania and Maryland had abolished primogeniture. Only South Carolina had abolished entail. Even in New England, where these laws had little, if any, effect directly, there seems to have been a custom which specified that when no will was left, distribution of property would take place, but with twice the amount going to the oldest son. In other words, the feudal union of kinship, solidarity, and land was a by no means insignificant aspect of colonial life. Nor, I should stress, without a certain amount of conflict. Because just so long as the great estates survived, generation after generation, just so long was land, good land, in shorter supply for the lower classes. Surely we would not find the abolition of primogeniture and entail so quick at the time of and just after the Revolutionary War, had there not been ample evidence of the unpopularity of the disproportion in ownership of land. Popular dislike of the landed aristocracy and its holdings could and did surface well before the Revolution, as, for example, in the tenant revolt in New York in 1776, in the regulator movement in North Carolina, and indeed long after the Revolution, up into the age of Jackson, in the still vast landed estates in New York. In summary, there was a feudal system, I believe, of personal dependence strongly rooted in ownership of land, a well-structured, visible class system, and giving powerful legal reinforcement in kinship, laws of primogeniture and entail in the American colonies prior to the Revolutionary War. And add to these incontestable elements a very considerable degree of establishment in religion.
Dr. Robert Nisbet has been discussing his thesis that a feudal system, and to some extent an established religion, existed in America before the Revolution. In just one moment, Dr. Nisbet will point out how the Revolution radically changed these conditions. Georgetown University is widely known for the successes of its alumni. This tradition of achievement began with William Gaston, who in 1791 became the first student to enroll at Georgetown. Gaston went on to become a congressman and later Chief Justice of North Carolina. Today, 30% of all the doctors and 40% of all the dentists in the Washington, D.C. area are Georgetown graduates, and more high-ranking government attorneys have been educated at Georgetown than any other American university. On the campus today, Dr. Robert Nisbet is continuing his lecture on how the American Revolution drastically altered social conditions in the colonies.
Now, let me turn to the revolution itself. I have tried to indicate my own conviction, siding, obviously, with one of the two major schools on this point in American historical writing at the present time, my conviction that feudalism was a reality in the colonies. And I have suggested also that in modern Western history, revolutions have had to do fundamentally with feudalism in its several aspects. Let us ask the question, would there have been a revolution, a social revolution in the colonies, rising from the social elements that I have mentioned and the issues which they generated, had war against England not broken out over the political rights of the colonists? In other words, if an international war had not broken the cake of custom, as war so often does, which gives it linkage with revolution in history, would a social revolution have been autonomously generated by the conditions that I have described? Who can ever be sure? My own guess, based speculatively on comparative history, is that no such change, at least of revolutionary dimension, would have occurred, though very probably most of the changes in social structure would have taken place more slowly over the period of the next half-century. Admittedly, we can only speculate. The nature and consequences of revolution are better known than the residual causes. What we do know is that the onset of the war with England generated in itself changes of a social character which could not help but have stimulated the latent social tensions and conflicts in the population. It is always this way, in some degree at least, with war. War and revolution have a great deal in common. Each is profoundly destructive of the traditions and authorities which make up civil society. With very good reason indeed, conservatives from ancient times on have been as suspicious of war as they have been of revolt or rebellion. Certainly there were measures taken in the interest of the war alone in the colonies which affected social institutions, inequalities, property, family, and other ties of dependence. But this had been the case also in Puritan England, in revolutionary France, and in Russia. In each of those three instances also, we are obliged to deal with the early stages of revolution in connection with war. One need only list those aspects of our contemporary welfare state which had their historical origins in not socialist ideology, but war emergency, to be made aware of how great is the role of war in the whole area of social reconstruction in the West. We are justified in assuming that had there been nothing but war, the political war with England, no pent-up forces of social reconstruction and change at all in the pre-revolutionary colonies, there would still have been significant alterations in the social structure following that war. Nevertheless, if we take the major areas of revolutionary change in the late 18th century in America, we are dealing in every instance with a condition that can be properly considered, I think, in distinction from the war itself. Let me take just three of these for brief consideration, each, to be sure, an important one. First, the relation between land and kinship. I have referenced specifically here to the abolition of primogeniture and entail. Although there had been pressure for a long time in each of the colonies where these feudal laws existed for their abolition, the fact remains that at the outbreak of the Revolutionary War, only Pennsylvania and Maryland had actually abolished primogeniture. Only South Carolina had abolished entail. But within a decade of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, every state but two had abolished entails, and those two were states in which entails were rare. And within 15 years, every state without exception had abolished primogeniture and in some form instituted equality of inheritance. Now, we may not today be inclined at first thought to regard the abolition of customs like primogeniture and entail as particularly revolutionary in change of social structure. We might, however, be advised by the testimony of the great 19th century French sociologist Frederick Laplace, undoubtedly the foremost comparative sociologist in Europe of his time, who considered abolition of primogeniture and entail the single most revolutionary change effected by the French Revolution. No longer now did family property go to the oldest son alone. Now it would go to all the children, daughters included. Only 2 states, North Carolina and New Jersey, failed to include daughters at the same level as sons. Elsewhere, full equality was the rule. If this does not astonish, merely look out on the number of inequalities between the sexes in law and custom which persist even in our equality-oriented society of 200 years later. As we know, Tocqueville, when he visited the United States in 1830-31, was impressed by the passion for equality in the United States almost above anything else that he witnessed. And he could not write enough about the almost messianic sense of zeal that Americans displayed about how they were the most equalized people on earth. If Tocqueville was sometimes skeptical in the reality, he was not skeptical of the sincerity, the genuineness of the feeling itself. Undoubtedly, a good deal of value in the way of the ties of dependence was lost under the thrust of the new equalitarian ideal during and after the Revolution, but much was gained too. We know that the Revolution was in substantial degree carried by youth. As is so often the case in history, the young tended more often to be on the side of the Revolution than the old. Not infrequently, families were divided in this respect. We learn that among all the leaders of the Revolution, very few were over 40 years of age. In this respect, too, you see, the American and the French revolutions have much in common, but we can perhaps find some of the relative moderation of the American Revolution in the fact that its leaders were not quite as young as were those who guided the Jacobins. There was some division, though it was far from perfect, in character, that is, in property lines. For the most part, the cause of the Revolution lay with the common people rather than with the aristocracy and the large landholders. Keeping in mind that Virginia and the South in general furnished some indispensable leaders from the aristocracy, the fact remains that in most parts of the colonies, Tories were much more likely to come from the large landowners and the wealthy than from the lower classes. Even so, it would be a mistake to try to find as perfect a division in terms of social classes as we can find in the French Revolution. The kind of analysis that such a historian as Georges Lefebvre has been able to make of the French Revolution and its division, almost absolute, by class, is impossible to make in the American Revolution. There were tenant farmers in abundance who thought, and with some justice, that there was greater likelihood of land distribution to be made in their favor by a victorious crown than by some of the Whig revolutionaries. One must be very careful in trying to class angle the American Revolution, but this fact in no way minimizes the existence of classes. There remains the large class of Negro slaves. It would be splendid if we were able to say that under the principles of liberty and equality, 500,000 blacks were given their freedom, and thus to get off to an earlier American start the long and tragic struggle for political, legal, and economic equality. Clearly, we cannot. But it would be a gross oversight to fail to note the impetus the Revolution gave to the Abolitionist movement. Well before the Revolutionary War began, there were intellectuals in all parts of the colonies, men of high social place, who had come to hate the slavery system and above all the ugly slavery trade across the Atlantic. At the time the Revolution broke out, there were about 500,000 slaves in the 13 colonies, most of them, of course, in the South, but a fair number in the North. Some 25,000 in New York, perhaps 55,000 in the whole of the North. The first anti-slavery society founded in the United States, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, was on April 14, 1775 in Philadelphia, most of the members being Quakers. Other such societies soon followed. The Continental Congress in 1774 had decreed an American Association, that is, a non-importation agreement, and the prohibition on slave trading seems to have held up throughout the war. Legislatures began to act. In July of 1774, Rhode Island passed a law to the effect that thenceforth all slaves brought in should be freed. The preamble to that bill is instructive insofar as the larger American mind is concerned. Whereas, the preamble begins, the inhabitants of America are generally engaged in the preservation of their own rights and liberties, among which that of personal freedom must be considered as the greatest, and as those who are desirous of enjoying all the advantages of liberty themselves should be willing to extend personal liberty to others. And there follows the text of the decree emancipating all black slaves brought into that state. Granted that the Revolution, in fighting for the freedom and rights of all men, failed for a variety of causes to free the 500,000 blacks, the fact remains that the ideas put forward under revolutionary impress were to prove powerful ideas in the long run, ideas to be found, indeed, in the recent civil rights revolution of our own day.
Dr. Robert Nisbet has been discussing social conditions in America before and after the Revolution, and how that revolution greatly affected the American way of life. In just one moment, he will continue his address from Gaston Hall at Georgetown University. Georgetown today is a study in contrast. Key Bridge, named after Francis Scott Key, is indeed a key artery joining the Virginia suburbs of Washington, D.C. with the city itself. The bridge spans the Potomac River and the old C&O Canal. The canal, which was once the heart of Georgetown's commerce, is now a recreation area, a place for quiet walks or a Sunday bicycle ride. But overhead, parallel to the path of the canal, is the flight path to Washington's busy national airport. In Georgetown University's Gaston Hall, Dr. Robert Nisbet is contrasting the social conditions in America before and after the Revolution.
Now, I want to turn in conclusion to a different but related problem. If I am correct in believing that a social revolution did indeed take place in conjunction with the War of Liberation, despite the existence of a long and impressive body of thought from Edmund Burke down to such historians as Hannah Arendt, J.L. Tallman, Daniel Burstein, Clinton Rossiter, Lewis Hartz, and others, despite the testimony which I regard as indeed very impressive against the position that I have taken here, but if I am correct in believing that a social revolution did indeed take place in conjunction with a war, why, we have to ask, did it never achieve the internal ferocity, the lasting hatred between antagonist parties, the fanaticism, and not least the atmosphere of terror that has so commonly gone with revolutions in modern history? I'm inclined to think that in very large degree it is the manifest lack of these elements of zeal and hatred afterward in the American Revolution that has led this long line of distinguished observers, beginning with Burke, to deny the label of revolution altogether to the momentous events in America at the end of the 18th century, and to thereby place the American Revolution in an essentially conservative context. I've said that I think it was a genuine social revolution, differing only in degree from the kinds of revolution that had occurred in Puritan England, France beginning 1789, and even in the Russia of 1918. And I would like to offer these few reasons for the phenomena of consensus and continuity of the American Revolution in contrast to what we know to exist in these other countries. First of all, the American Revolution was necessarily a dispersed revolution. Nothing comparable to a London, Paris, or Moscow existed in America. That is, a large, powerful city steeped in historical traditions of turbulence. Nor was there in America anything approximating the centralization of rule of the other countries. England had become the most centralized polity in Europe at the time of the Puritan Revolt. France was very centralized, as a long line of historians beginning with Tocqueville has shown us, and certainly there was ample centralization of government, however ineptly exercised, in Russia. Nothing of this sort existed, however, or could have existed in America. Our 5 cities were small and modest indeed by European standards, and there is nothing to suggest that they contained very many of the elements of incipient revolt which were to be found in some of the European cities. Moreover, given the background of a highly distinct and proudly separate colonies, it was wholly unlikely that any city where the new American central government might lie could possibly have intimidated the states and their governments. In some, the spirit of restraint was rooted in substantial degree in the practical realities of localism and regionalism. Second, also there is the fact of the spirit and structure of intermediate association, of voluntary association in the United States. I'm aware that fear of conspiracy, such as that attending word of the organization of the Society of Cincinnati, and soon after fear of Masons, Catholic groups, and others, is a constant feature of American history. The late Richard Hofstadter has written definitively of this. Nevertheless, as European visitors early became aware, there was an inherent buoyancy of associational mutual aid, of self-help, of desire for functional association that stood in striking contrast to European experiences where political centralization had rendered many such associations weak before the revolutions in those countries and their legal contexts precarious. The revolutionary government in France in 1791, even before Jacobin repression was at its height, made all associations above a certain small number of members illegal. And this issue of freedom of association remained a vital one in French politics for many decades. There is none of that in America, and there is nothing like a vigorous intermediate area of voluntary association to take the heat off the political state and to prevent social interests from compulsively becoming translated into political crusades and movements. Third, I account the continuing religious quality of American culture an important factor. Granted that there is evidence of a falling off of religious devotions in the 18th century, and that the war itself hurt religion and churches badly. Granted, too, that few, if any, of the principals, the leading figures in the Revolution, were notably religious. Nevertheless, religion was strong in its American roots. The great revivals to come in the early 19th century would surely suggest this. And while there was dislike of religious establishment, as we have seen, there was little, if any, of that blind hate, that ingrained anti-clericalism that the Roman Catholic Church had brought upon itself in France, or that the Anglican Church had in England earlier, or the Russian Orthodox Church by the beginning of the 20th century. And in this very continuation of religious spirit among large numbers of people, there was provided from the outset, I suggest, an important counterpower to political zeal. High among the reasons, I think, for the absence of the kind of destructive zeal and ideological militance in America that we associate properly with other modern revolutions is the lack of an intellectual class in the American colonies that is in any way comparable to the philosophes in France or to the Bolsheviks, revolutionaries in general, in Russia, each with an ingrained antagonism to an ancien regime. I'm well aware that in individuals like Jefferson, Adams, Dickinson, Randolph, and others who prominently figured in the colonies during the 1770s and 1780s and who helped lead the revolution, that we are dealing with superbly educated minds, minds moreover actuated by assumptions and ideals of natural rights, including the right to equality. But these leaders were almost entirely men whose lives were rooted in their social order. Very different is the line of intellectuals in Europe that has figured so prominently in its revolutionary disturbances a line characterized from the Italian humanists onward by a kind of rootlessness, an alienation from society, an overriding hostility toward traditional structures of authority, and far from least, an obsession with power for its own sake. In America of the 18th century, we have nothing comparable to a Puritan New Model Army Council of agitators. No Lilburn, no levelers, no diggers, least of all did we have a Robespierre and Saint-Just, a Lenin and Trotsky. And it is in this respect, I believe, that pragmatism asserted itself in America. Also, it might be noted, and this too gives the American Revolution a certain uniqueness, the same group that started it, that is, those who were its leaders at the outset, were its leaders at the conclusion. Very different the French Revolution, which was begun, as we know, by a group of moderate-minded aristocrats interested really in little more than reclaiming some of the rights of the nobility which had been lost to the Bourbon House. Their places, as we know, were taken by a succession of leaders, each prior to Thermidor, more radical, more revolutionary than the predecessors. Sixth, there is the fact that the war with England, for all of its difficulties and hardships and occasional doubts of success, was won so clearly and decisively, with such manifest benefits to almost all the inhabitants, that the war itself was never able to become a burning issue, as, for example, Vietnam became in the 1960s and may prove to be for a long time, as the war in France proved to be for decades and decades after Napoleon's defeat, and so forth. There was substantial consensus once it was over, and while Tories owning large estates saw these confiscated, producing bitterness beyond any question, nevertheless, that canker never had a chance really to develop internally in America. The important point is that unlike the English, French, and Russian situations, consensus tended rather quickly to prevail. Whereas the French Revolution remained a burning issue for generations, indeed to this very day producing fundamental divisions in politics, this was not, it never has been the case in America. Hence the remarkable fact that the Revolution in America could become an almost universal object of celebration by conservatives, liberals, and radicals. Finally, there is the fact that at no time were there completely absorptive class lines in the American War and Revolution. I noted above that on the whole, the common people were the stoutest advocates of the Revolution and the war with England, the wealthy and the educated less so. And in the large, this is true. But if we look into the local ties of classes, we often find something quite different. That there were tenant farmers, for example, with strong sympathies for the British forces is well known. These individuals could see a better future for themselves so far as land holdings were concerned, resulting from the Crown's victory than from anything associated with the Whig landowners that the tenants knew only too well. But the only important point here is that while the generalization uttered above has some validity, that is, a larger proportion of the common people than of the wealthy and the educated classes supported the Revolution, the exceptions are sufficiently numerous in the colonies to make for a very different situation than existed in France before and during the Revolution there. In conclusion, the American Revolution was indeed that, a revolution, social, institutional, and moral, as well as a war of political liberation from England. The internal aspect may not seem as brilliant as the external, a fault, I think, largely of our history books, but the evidence suggests to me that the two were closely intertwined. To refer to it, as some of our finest scholars have, as a purely local affair, as something carrying with it little more than political changeover of Anglo-Saxon governors, seems to me short-sighted and crippling to our self-image. Assuredly, such a conception does injury to the view the makers of the Revolution themselves took. Whether a radical Sam Adams, a liberal Jefferson, or a conservative John Adams. The line from the social revolution of the 1780s to the civil rights movement of the 1960s is a direct one. The United States is indeed, in its history, a process of almost continuous revolution, and I can think of no greater injustice to ourselves than to deny that fact and to allow the honorable metaphor of revolution to be preempted by societies today in which revolution has been made all but impossible. Thank you.
We have just heard a lecture by Dr. Robert Nisbet on the social impact of the American Revolution. Dr. Nisbet pointed out that a social revolution occurred in America in conjunction with the Revolutionary War. Tonight's lecture is one of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute dealing with many aspects of the American Revolution and how that revolution still affects America and the world today. If you would like a copy of Dr. Nisbet's lecture or of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute. That's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.